The temperature outside Declan O'Rourke's cabin had dropped to 23 degrees below zero. Inside, his wife Saoirse and infant daughter Niamh slept without heavy blankets in air that held steady at 44 degrees, while 3 miles east, Cormac Sullivan's family burned furniture to survive in a cabin that had dropped to 15 degrees despite a roaring fire. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1836. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was still profitable enough to draw men willing to risk everything for a season's worth of beaver pelts. Declan O'Rourke was one of those men, though he approached trapping with more caution than most. He had survived 6 winters in the mountains of Montana Territory, working the streams that fed into the Yellowstone River. He was 32 years old, Irish-born, and competent in the specific ways that kept men alive in country that killed the careless with brutal efficiency. Declan's cabin sat in a valley sheltered by ridges on 3 sides, close enough to beaver ponds to make trapping practical but far enough from established trails to avoid unwanted attention. The cabin was typical of frontier construction. Logs notched at the corners, gaps chinked with moss and mud, a single door, one small window covered with oiled paper, and a stone fireplace he had built with reasonable skill. It had taken him and another trapper 5 days to build the previous spring. It kept out wind and most rain. That was sufficient, or so he had believed. He shared the cabin with his wife Saoirse, who had followed him west from St. Louis 2 years earlier, when most sensible women refused to live beyond civilization's edge. She was practical, uncomplaining, and stronger than her small frame suggested. Their son Seamus had been born the previous autumn, healthy and loud, giving them hope that they could build something permanent in this temporary world. The night of February 9th, 1836, brought cold that felt solid, absolute. Declan had loaded the fireplace with split pine before lying down to sleep, building the fire high enough to last through most of the night. The interior was warm when they settled into their sleeping robes. Seamus slept in a wooden box near the fireplace, wrapped in wool blankets and furs. Declan woke at first light. The cabin was silent except for wind outside. The fire had died to ash and a few barely glowing coals. He rose immediately, knowing that rebuilding the fire was the first priority of every winter morning. The air inside the cabin was cold enough that his breath showed white. He moved to the fireplace, began arranging kindling, and glanced toward where Seamus slept. The child was too still. Declan crossed the cabin in 3 steps. He knew before he touched his son that something was wrong. Seamus's face was pale, lips slightly blue. The child's skin was cold. Declan picked him up, felt for breath, found nothing. He called for Saoirse. She woke, saw Declan holding their son, and understood immediately. They tried to warm him. They held him near the rebuilt fire. They rubbed his small limbs. They did everything instinct demanded, but Seamus was gone. The cold had taken him some time in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the fire had burned down and the cabin's interior temperature had dropped below what an infant could survive. They buried him that afternoon on a hillside above the valley. Declan dug through frozen ground for 3 hours, breaking through soil that resisted the shovel with every strike. They marked the grave with stones and stood in silence while wind carried snow across the barren slope. That night, Declan rebuilt the fire and sat watching it burn, unable to sleep. Saoirse lay in their sleeping robes, awake but quiet. Neither spoke. The cabin felt different now. Every log, every gap in the chinking, every cold draft that snuck through imperfect construction felt like evidence of failure. Declan continued trapping through the rest of that winter, checking his lines mechanically, processing pelts without thought. But his mind stayed fixed on a single problem. The cabin had failed. More specifically, he had failed to understand what a cabin needed to be. He began measuring temperature. He borrowed a thermometer from a trader passing through in early March, paying too much for it, but needing the precision it offered. Every morning before dawn, he recorded the interior temperature. Every evening, after loading the fireplace, he recorded it again. The pattern became clear quickly. Evening temperature with fire burning strong, 50 to 60 degrees. Morning temperature after fire died, 15 to 25 degrees. The cabin lost 30 to 40 degrees every night. Even when the fire burned well, even when he woke twice to add wood, the temperature still dropped dangerously low in the hours before dawn. He started examining the cabin's construction with new attention. He pressed his hand against the interior log walls on cold mornings. The wood was cold to the touch, sometimes cold enough to hurt his palm. The logs themselves were conducting exterior cold directly into the living space. The chinking between logs helped somewhat, but gaps remained where cold air infiltrated constantly. The fireplace provided heat, but that heat rose to the ceiling and escaped through imperfect roof construction, while the walls remained cold barriers that pulled warmth from the air. Declan realized something fundamental. A cabin was not a container that held heat. It was a structure that leaked heat constantly, while simultaneously conducting cold inward through every surface. Fighting that reality with a single interior fire was a battle you could never win. Over the following weeks, as winter loosened its grip and trapping season wound down, Declan visited other cabins scattered through the territory. He talked to trappers about their winter experiences. Nearly every man had similar stories: fires that died in the night, mornings so cold that water froze inside cabins, close calls with freezing, especially when sickness or injury prevented someone from maintaining the fire. One trapper named Thomas Reed described waking to find frost on the interior walls of his cabin despite a fire that had burned until just 2 hours before dawn. Another, a French-Canadian named Baptiste, said he had lost 3 toes to frostbite after falling asleep too far from his fireplace on a night when the fire burned down faster than expected. The pattern was universal. Mountain cabins could not maintain warmth overnight. Every trapper accepted this as unchangeable reality, as fundamental as weather or seasons. You built the best fire you could, you slept close to it, and you hoped you woke before it died completely. But Declan could not accept that reality anymore. His son had died because of it. Somewhere, there had to be a solution. The question that obsessed him through late winter and into spring was simple, but seemingly impossible to answer. How do you keep a cabin warm when you are asleep and the fire dies down? Declan left the mountains in May of 1836 to sell his winter's catch in St. Louis. The journey took 3 weeks on horseback, following established trails east through passes still choked with late spring snow. Saoirse traveled with him. Neither wanted to stay in the cabin where Seamus had died. During those long days of travel, Declan's mind kept returning to a memory from childhood in County Cork. His uncle Padraig had been a blacksmith, and Declan had spent countless hours in that smithy as a boy, watching his uncle work iron into tools and hardware. What he remembered most clearly was the heat. The forge would burn intensely during working hours, heating iron to glowing orange. But what fascinated young Declan was what happened after his uncle finished work for the day. The forge would be banked, the fire reduced to coals, yet the smithy remained warm for hours afterward. The stone floor, the brick forge structure, the thick walls all held heat, and released it slowly through the evening. Padraig's family lived in rooms above the smithy, and those rooms stayed comfortable through winter nights long after the forge had gone cold. Stone held heat. That was the principle Declan had witnessed but never fully understood until now. In St. Louis, Declan sold his pelts for a decent price. Most trappers immediately spent their earnings on whiskey, wowoki, entertainment, and supplies for the next season. Declan spent his money differently. He spent 2 weeks studying buildings. He watched masons constructing a stone foundation for a warehouse near the riverfront. He observed how they selected stones, how they fitted them together, how they used different sizes for different purposes. He visited a bakery and talked with the owner about brick ovens. The baker explained that once the oven was heated properly, it would maintain baking temperature for 6 to 8 hours without additional fuel. The brick mass absorbed heat and released it gradually. Declan examined the stone foundations of the older buildings in St. Louis's French Quarter. He noted how thick walls stayed cool in summer heat, moderating interior temperature through thermal mass. He talked to a stonemason who explained that dark stone absorbed and retained heat better than light-colored stone. Dense river rock was better than porous limestone. He bought books on basic engineering principles, though his reading skills were limited. He studied diagrams showing heat flow and insulation concepts. Most importantly, he developed a theory. If stone could hold heat from a forge or oven for hours, could stone placed around a cabin hold heat the same way? Could you heat the stone rather than trying to heat the air? Before leaving St. Louis, Declan purchased unusual supplies: 200 pounds of dark river stones, carefully selected for uniform size, iron grating, specialized masonry tools. Other trappers, heading back to the mountains, thought he had lost his mind. Stone was heavy, difficult to transport, and served no obvious purpose in a trapper's kit. Declan loaded it anyway. Declan returned to Montana Territory in late July of 1836. He did not return to the cabin where Seamus had died. Instead, he selected a new location 3 miles north, on higher ground with better drainage and clear sight lines in all directions. The spot was less convenient to his trap lines, but Declan was no longer prioritizing convenience. He built a new cabin first, using improved techniques he had observed in St. Louis: tighter log fitting, better chinking, a more efficient fireplace design. The work took 5 weeks. When finished, the cabin was solid and well constructed by frontier standards. But the cabin itself was not the innovation Declan had traveled 800 miles planning. The innovation would surround the cabin. In early September, Declan began laying out a circle in the dirt around the cabin's perimeter. The circle measured 3 feet from the cabin walls at all points. Saoirse watched from the doorway as he marked the ground with stakes and cord. "You are building a wall," she said. "A ring," Declan corrected. "A thermal ring." He explained his reasoning, though he knew it sounded strange even to his own ears. The cabin walls would always conduct cold inward. That was unavoidable physics. But if he could create a heat source outside the cabin, radiating warmth toward the walls, he could counter that cold infiltration. Stone heated to high temperature would radiate heat for hours. If he built a stone structure around the cabin and heated that stone, the cabin would sit inside an envelope of radiant warmth. Saoirse listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question: "Will it work?" "I do not know," Declan admitted, "but I know what happens if we do nothing." She nodded and went back inside. Declan dug a foundation trench for the ring, 6 inches deep, following the circular layout. He filled the trench with gravel for drainage and stability. Then he began selecting stones from the riverbed half a mile away. He rejected light-colored stones, stones with cracks, stones that were too porous. He wanted dense, dark river rock that would absorb and hold heat efficiently. The work was brutally physical. Each stone weighed 15 to 30 pounds. He carried them individually from the river to the cabin site, making dozens of trips each day. Other trappers passing through stopped to watch, bemused by the sight of a grown man hauling rocks when he should have been preparing for trapping season. The first layer of the ring went down in mid-September. Declan placed each stone carefully, fitting them together as tightly as possible. But he did not build a solid wall. He left gaps, creating chambers within the stone structure. These chambers were deliberate, essential to his design. They would hold fire. The ring would not just be heated stone, the ring would contain fire within its mass, turning the entire structure into a radiant heating system that surrounded his cabin. The critical innovation in Declan's design was not the stone ring itself, but what existed within the stone structure. He was building fire chambers directly into the ring's construction, spaces where flames could burn, while stone mass surrounded and absorbed their heat. Declan divided the ring into 8 sections, placing a fire chamber at each point like compass directions around the cabin. Each chamber was approximately 18 inches wide and 20 inches deep, created by arranging stones to form hollow pockets within the otherwise solid ring structure. The chambers were not closed boxes. They connected through narrow gaps that allowed air circulation throughout the entire ring system. The physics principle was straightforward. Fire needs oxygen. Contained fire without airflow suffocates quickly. Declan designed his chambers with ventilation channels that drew air from outside the ring, fed it through the burning chambers, and allowed smoke to escape upward while heat radiated into the surrounding stone mass. He built feeding slots into the exterior face of each chamber. These slots were angled openings, narrow enough to contain fire but wide enough to accept split firewood. A person standing outside the ring could feed wood into any chamber without dismantling stones or opening large gaps that would release accumulated heat. The interior faces of the chambers, the sides facing toward the cabin, were left more open. Heat from burning wood would radiate directly toward the cabin walls, but more importantly, it would heat the stone mass between the chambers. Stone heated from within by sustained fire would hold that heat for hours after flames died down. Declan tested the concept with a single chamber before completing the entire ring. He built a small fire inside one completed section using dry pine kindling and small split logs. The fire caught quickly, burned cleanly, and within an hour the surrounding stones were hot enough that he could not keep his palm pressed against them for more than a few seconds. He let the fire burn down to coals, then measured how long the stones retained heat. 4 hours after the flames died completely, the stones were still noticeably warm. 6 hours later, they held residual heat. 8 hours later, they had cooled but remained slightly warmer than ambient air temperature. The test proved his theory. Stone heated from within by contained fire would retain and radiate that heat for most of a night. Multiple chambers burning simultaneously would create overlapping zones of radiant warmth around the entire cabin perimeter. Declan continued building through October, placing each stone with obsessive care. He created caps for the chambers using flat stones that would prevent heat from escaping upward while still allowing smoke to vent. He built slight slopes into the chamber floors so ash would accumulate in corners where it could be removed periodically through small access ports. The ring rose to 2 feet in height, a continuous stone structure surrounding the cabin at a distance of 3 feet from the walls. From above, it would look like a perfect circle of dark stone with 8 points where fire chambers waited to be lit. By late October of 1836, the thermal rock ring was structurally complete, but Declan spent the next 3 weeks refining details that would determine whether his system worked or failed catastrophically. He added stone caps over each fire chamber, creating partial covers that trapped rising heat while allowing smoke to escape through narrow vents. The caps were not sealed. They sat on supporting stones with deliberate gaps, creating a chimney effect that drew air through the chambers while directing heat downward into the stone mass. Declan built an ash removal system into each chamber. Small openings at the base of the exterior wall allowed him to rake out accumulated ash without disturbing the fire or dismantling stones. Ash buildup would eventually insulate the stone from direct heat contact, reducing efficiency. Regular removal was essential. He experimented with fire timing and wood consumption rates. A fire built with split pine burned hot but fast, heating stones quickly but requiring frequent feeding. A fire built with denser hardwood burned cooler but longer, providing sustained heat with less attention. Declan settled on a mixed approach: pine kindling to establish flames quickly, then hardwood to maintain steady burning. The optimal schedule emerged through trial and error. Fires started at dusk when air temperature began dropping, gave the stones 3 to 4 hours of direct heating before the main cold of night set in. By the time flames died down to coals around midnight, the stone mass had absorbed enough heat to radiate warmth through the remaining night hours. Declan measured stone surface temperatures with careful hand testing, timing how long he could keep his palm pressed against the heated rock. Stones reaching temperatures where he could not maintain contact for more than 5 seconds were hot enough to provide significant radiant heat. Stones heated to that level would remain effective radiators for 6 to 8 hours. Wood consumption was actually lower than he had expected. 8 small fires burning simultaneously used less total wood than a single large interior fire maintained through the night. The efficiency came from the thermal mass effect. Once heated, the stones continued working without additional fuel input. The first snow came in early November. Declan lit all 8 chambers one evening, feeding each with kindling and split logs. Within 2 hours, the snow within 5 feet of the ring had melted completely. The ground around the cabin remained bare and dry, while everywhere else showed 3 inches of fresh snow cover. The radiant heat was visible in the melted zone. It was measurable in the stone temperature, but the real test would be interior cabin temperature through a full night of freezing conditions. Declan waited for the right night. The weather provided it in mid-November, when clear skies and northern wind brought temperatures down to 10 degrees above zero. He lit the ring fires at dusk. Inside the cabin, he placed his thermometer on the table, away from the interior fireplace. Then he and Saoirse settled in to monitor what happened through the night. Word of Declan's stone ring spread through the scattered trapping community during the autumn of 1836. Trappers traveling through the area stopped to see what O'Rourke had built. Most reacted with immediate skepticism, bordering on mockery. Cormac Sullivan arrived in late November with 2 other trappers. Sullivan was Irish like Declan, a few years older, and had survived 9 winters in the mountains. He walked around the thermal ring twice, examining the construction, peering into the fire chambers, testing the stone with his hands. "You have built a magnificent wall around your cabin, O'Rourke," Sullivan said, "but you have built it on the wrong side." The other trappers laughed. One of them, a French-Canadian named Laurent, shook his head. "You are heating the snow, the outside air. Fire belongs inside where people live, not outside where heat escapes to nothing." Declan did not argue. He had learned that explaining the thermal mass principle to men who had never studied heat retention was pointless. They saw fire outside a cabin and concluded the heat was wasted. The concept that stone could store and radiate heat for hours was foreign to their experience. "You will burn twice the wood for half the warmth," Sullivan predicted. "By January, you will abandon this and heat your cabin like a sensible man." Another trapper who visited that week called it O'Rourke's Fool Ring. The name stuck. Within a month, trappers throughout the territory referred to Declan's innovation with that mocking title. When men gathered at trading posts or crossed paths on trap lines, someone would inevitably mention the Irishman who was heating the wilderness instead of his cabin. Declan heard the stories through Saoirse, who heard them from a trader's wife. He did not respond. He did not defend his work or try to convince skeptics. He simply continued refining his system through early winter. He learned the optimal wood size for each chamber. Pieces split to 3 inches thick burned most efficiently, providing sustained heat without creating flames so large they wasted energy. He learned that feeding chambers every 3 hours maintained consistent stone temperature better than loading them heavily once and letting them burn down. He discovered that wind direction mattered. Strong north wind could cool the exterior stone faces faster than radiant heat from the chambers could compensate. He built small stone deflectors at the north-facing chambers to protect them from direct wind. By December, Declan had settled into an efficient routine: light fires at dusk, feed chambers at 9 in the evening, and again at midnight. Let them burn down naturally after that. The system maintained interior cabin temperature between 40 and 48 degrees through nights when exterior temperature dropped below zero. Sullivan visited again in mid-December. Declan invited him to place his hand on the cabin's interior wall near the floor. The log was warm to the touch. Sullivan said nothing, but his expression showed confusion. He left without comment. The winter of 1836 brought weather that tested every structure and every man in Montana Territory. December was cold, but manageable. January brought something worse. A high-pressure system settled over the region, bringing clear skies, no wind, and temperatures that dropped to levels experienced trappers had rarely seen. The cold snap began on January 14, 1837. By evening, the temperature had fallen to 15 degrees below zero. By midnight, it reached 25 below. The air felt solid, sharp enough to hurt lungs with each breath. Wood smoke froze and fell like snow. Any exposed metal burned skin on contact. Declan lit his ring fires at dusk as usual, but he fed them more heavily than normal, building larger flames in each chamber. He added wood every 2 hours instead of every 3. The stone ring glowed faintly orange in the darkness, visible heat radiating from 8 points around the cabin perimeter. Inside, Saoirse kept a small fire burning in the fireplace, supplemental heat to combine with the exterior ring system. The interior thermometer read 46 degrees at midnight, cold enough to sea breath, but survivable without heavy furs. Saoirse and their infant daughter Niamh, born in October, slept in the bed with wool blankets. The child showed no signs of distress from cold. Declan stayed awake through most of the night, feeding the ring fires, monitoring the system. He stepped outside every hour to check the stones. Even in air cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, the stone ring remained warm. Not hot like during evening hours, but noticeably warmer than ambient temperature. The radiant heat created a zone around the cabin where the brutal cold was diminished. The second night was colder, 28 below zero by Declan's thermometer. He increased wood consumption again, keeping flames active in all 8 chambers through the night. Interior temperature dropped to 43 degrees by dawn, but held there. Saoirse and Niamh remained comfortable. The third night reached 30 below zero. This was cold that killed men who made mistakes, who let fires die, who underestimated how fast warmth could leave a body. Declan fed his ring fires constantly, going through split wood at a rate that concerned him. But the system continued working. Interior temperature fluctuated between 41 and 44 degrees through the night. By morning of the 4th day, Declan was exhausted but confident. His thermal rock ring had survived the worst weather he had experienced in 7 winters. The system worked not through luck, but through physics. Stone heated from within radiated that heat outward and inward. The cabin sat in a pocket of relative warmth, even when surrounding air reached killing temperatures. Other trappers scattered through the territory were not as fortunate. Standard cabins with single interior fireplaces struggled to maintain temperatures above freezing. Men burned through their winter wood supplies at unsustainable rates, feeding fires desperately to stay ahead of the cold. The 4th morning of the cold snap brought Cormac Sullivan to Declan's door shortly after dawn. Sullivan looked exhausted, frost in his beard, his face showing the drawn look of a man who had not slept. He was alone, having walked 2 miles through snow in air, still hovering near 20 below zero. Declan opened the door. Sullivan stepped inside and stopped immediately. His eyes went to the thermometer on the table, 43 degrees. He looked at Saoirse, who sat near the small fireplace nursing Niamh. The child was calm, healthy, showing none of the lethargy that came from dangerous cold exposure. "My cabin is 15 degrees inside," Sullivan said. "We burned everything we could. Furniture, extra tools, my daughter's cradle. The fire died anyway around 4 this morning. My wife and children are huddled under every blanket and fur we own. I need help, O'Rourke." Declan grabbed his coat. "How long to get back to your cabin?" 40 minutes in this cold." "We go now. Saoirse, keep the interior fire low. The ring will hold." "Declan." And Sullivan moved quickly through the pre-dawn darkness. The cold was savage, attacking any exposed skin within seconds. They did not speak during the walk, conserving energy and warmth. Sullivan's cabin appeared through morning twilight, chimney showing minimal smoke. Inside, Sullivan's wife Mary held their 3 children close. The interior was brutally cold, breath hung visible in the air. Ice had formed on the interior walls near the door, where gaps in chinking allowed moisture and cold to interact. Declan rebuilt their fire first, using wood from Sullivan's diminished supply. He got flames established, creating immediate heat. But he knew this was temporary. The cabin would lose that heat as fast as it was generated. "Come back to my cabin," Declan said. "All of you. Bring what you need for 2 days." Sullivan started to refuse, then looked at his children and nodded. They made the journey in 2 trips, Mary and the children first, then Sullivan with supplies. By mid-morning, Sullivan's entire family was in Declan's cabin, warm, safe, and bewildered by the stable temperature. Sullivan stood outside with Declan watching the thermal ring. The morning sun illuminated the stone structure. Residual heat from the night fires still radiated from the chambers. Sullivan placed his palm against the stone. It was warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. "God in heaven, O'Rourke," Sullivan said quietly. "You were not heating the snow. You were heating the cabin from outside. The stone holds it." "Stone heated properly holds warmth for 8 hours or more," Declan said. "Long enough to get through the night. Long enough to survive." Sullivan examined the fire chambers, the feeding slots, the ventilation design. He studied how the stones were arranged, how the system functioned as an integrated whole. "Will you show me how to build this?" Sullivan asked. "Yes," Declan said. Over the next 5 years, thermal rock rings spread through the Irish and Scottish settlements scattered across Montana and Wyoming territories. Cormac Sullivan built the second ring around his reconstructed cabin in the spring of 1837. He shared the technique with his brother-in-law, who built the third. By 1840, at least 20 cabins in the region featured variations of what trappers now called O'Rourke rings. The design evolved as others adapted it. Some builders created square rings instead of circular ones, matching the cabin footprint more precisely. Others built partial rings on the north and west sides only, where prevailing winter winds created the greatest cold infiltration. German settlers modified the chamber design, creating more efficient airflow patterns. Norwegian trappers incorporated elements from their homeland's heating traditions, adding features that improved heat retention. But the core principle remained constant. Stone heated from within by contained fire would radiate warmth for hours. A cabin surrounded by thermal mass could maintain survivable interior temperature through winter nights that killed people in standard construction. The Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed by 1843. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in accessible areas. Fashion changed and silk replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying demand. Trappers left the mountains, heading to Oregon, California, or back to eastern settlements. The era of the mountain man ended, but the cabins remained. Settlers moving west along expanding trails discovered abandoned O'Rourke ring cabins and recognized their superior design. Some were reoccupied and maintained. Others served as shelters for travelers. The stone rings continued functioning for anyone who understood how to use them. Declan left Montana Territory in 1845. He and Saoirse, along with their daughter Niamh and 2 younger children born after the brutal winter, settled in Oregon's Willamette Valley. Declan bought land and raised cattle. He lived quietly, integrated into a small farming community, and never spoke much about his trapping years. He died in 1873 at age 69, buried in a modest cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed his name, birth and death years, and nothing else. No mention of innovation or survival technique. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a rancher who had come west decades earlier. But in Montana and Wyoming, stone rings still encircled old cabins in valleys where trappers had once worked. Modern historians estimate that several dozen lives were saved over the following decades because people built or occupied cabins with thermal ring systems. Families survived winters they otherwise would not have. Children grew to adulthood who might have frozen. The impossible had become routine. A man could heat his cabin from the outside. Stone could hold warmth through killing cold. And Declan O'Rourke proved that the best innovations do not fight nature, but work with it, turning cold stone into lasting warmth that outlived the man who imagined it into existence.